Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Greetings.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, panelists, for joining. We've just got one more minute until we start. But just to let you know, we've already started the streaming on Facebook so that we're all ready to go. And we're just waiting for a few more people to join and then we'll start the event. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining for the event today. And we'll start in less than a minute.
Great, thank you.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. We're going to start the event now. Thank you for the panelists for joining and also for all the participants. My name's Alan Ware and I'm the Global Coordinator of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and also one of the co-founders of Unfold Zero, which is a platform set up to promote the United Nations processes and initiatives for nuclear disarmament. And this event is also co-sponsored today by the Basel Peace Office, the World Future Council, and the Right Livelihood Foundation, and also Youth Fusion. So we have had registrations from nearly 300 people from around the world, from 44 countries. At some stage, we'll see how many people actually managed to come on. But these are people registering from as far west as the west coast of the United States, and all the way east to East Asia and the Pacific, where it's very, very late at the moment after midnight. And so thank you for people for coming on from all over the world. And we do encourage you to put your name and where you're from in the chat session. So as we're continuing the event, we see where people are coming from. We have some excellent speakers today, today what we're doing is commemorating the 75th anniversary of the very first resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, which is Resolution 11, which set forward the global goal for the elimination of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. And then part of today is also to talk about other United Nations initiatives. We've just had the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but there are also other ways that the United Nations has been involved and other ways that governments and civil society have been using the forum of the United Nations to be able to advance nuclear disarmament. So just before I introduce the speakers, we're just going to do two very quick polls just to get a little bit more from our participants so that we have a bit of an idea of who is participating in us. And then after we've done these two quick polls, I'll then introduce our speakers. So what we ask you to do is fill in the polls. There's two questions that will be here on the poll. One is about yourself, how you would describe yourself, and the next is your perspective about the United Nations and nuclear disarmament. So the questions are now on the screen. And we ask you to fill in how you would describe yourself as a student, youth, or academic scientist, or representative of a civil society organization, legislator, representative of an international organization, a government official or employee, and just an interested individual or activist, so retired, senior or wise elder or other. And then when you've done that question, there's another one just below that, which asks you, what do you think about the United Nations and nuclear disarmament? And choose the statement that best reflects your views. Do you think that the UN plays a vital leadership role to advance nuclear disarmament? or that the UN does not have much influence on nuclear weapons policies of governments, or the UN can be effective if civil society and like-minded countries use it to advance nuclear disarmament, or you don't know yet much about the UN and nuclear disarmament. So we have so far half the people on the participants have polled. So I'll leave the poll open just a little bit longer to give you time to fill it in. And then what I'll do is I'll share the result of the polling so that you also get to see a little bit about what types of people are participating in this event and what their general perspectives, very general of course, on the UN and nuclear disarmament. We're up to 70% of voting, so I'll just give maybe in one more minute to finish the voting. Okay, 30 more seconds to finish the voting. So if you haven't done it, please fill in quickly. Okay, I'm going to end the polling now. Oh, there's still just a couple more coming in. Okay, yeah, okay, I'm going to end the polling now because we do need to move on to the speakers. I'm ending it. I'll share the results. So here we see, you should be able to see that the people who are participating today include some young people, some academics and scientists, quite a large number of representatives from civil society organizations, one legislator it looks like, some representatives of international organizations like the UN, some government representatives, some interested activists, and some retired senior or wise elders. So we have quite a cross spectrum of people participating. And in terms of the views, we had roughly a quarter saying that the UN plays a vital leadership role. Very few of you think that the UN does not have much influence. And then a largest number, the UN can be effective if civil society and like-minded countries make the best use of it. So thank you very much. That gives a little bit of an idea of who we are and our thoughts on the UN. And with that, I will now move ahead and introduce our first speaker, who is Her Excellency Tatiana Valovaya, who is a long-time diplomat, originally from the Russian Federation, and who is now serving as the Director General of the United Nations in Geneva, the special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations to the Conference on Disarmament, and so has got a lot of oversight of what happens in the disarmament field in the United Nations. So Ambassador Valovaya, it's wonderful that you could join us, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts about the United Nations and nuclear disarmament.
Thank you, Alan. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, first of all, I would like to thank Basel Peace Office parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, Unfold Zero, and the World Future Council and Youth Fusion for organizing this timely event at such a pivotal moment. And I would like to thank you for your belief in the United Nations, as your poll really shows that the majority of participants believe that the United Nations can play a significant role in preserving peace and fighting for nuclear disarmament. And the elimination of nuclear weapons has been the United Nations' highest disarmament priority from day one. The first resolution, as it was already mentioned, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on the 24th January 1946, reflected the commitment of the member states to pursue nuclear disarmament in the aftermath of the disastrous human impact of atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 75 years later, and despite unquestionable progress in the reduction of nuclear arsenals, the elimination of nuclear weapons remains an elusive goal. There is an urgent need for the international community to fully recommit to the principle of nuclear disarmament and to take urgent measures to implement it. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has recently stated, 75 years is far too long to have lived in the shadow of nuclear Armageddon. 75 years since the adoption of the first General Assembly resolution, the risk of a nuclear weapon being used either intentionally by accident or through miscalculation remains unacceptably high. The steady erosion of disarmament and arms control instruments entails growing risks for the security of all nations. Last year, the doomsday clock or the bulletin of the atomic scientist was reset to just 100 seconds before midnight, the closest we have ever been to the theoretical complete annihilation of the Earth. Therefore, there is no longer room for error or further delay. 2021 is a crucial year for the global nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control regimes. The postponed review conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons is now scheduled to take place this summer. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force just last Friday. Last week, the Conference on Disarmament opened its first plenary session of 2021. As the Secretary General of the conference, I urged the member states to overcome their differences and to start without delay a meaningful dialogue that addresses the key substantive issues on which states must focus to make progress, including on nuclear disarmament. What has been missing in that conference is neither substantive knowledge of its members, nor where the subject matters, but rather the political will to build on them. Progress towards the elimination of nuclear weapons has stalled for decades. The demise of some arms control treaties and the withdrawal of some important parties from bilateral and multilateral disarmament instruments have further undermined trust between states in all disarmament fora, thereby making exceedingly difficult, meaningful negotiations on the disarmament agenda. The international multilateral system, created in the aftermath of the Second World War, is currently undergoing its most important transformation. The world has greatly changed since 1945, and multilateralism itself is changing in its nature. Nowadays, states remain, of course, the major players in international relations. As before, they play a fundamental role within any international institutions, first and foremost in the United Nations. However, they are no longer the sole actors in international relations. The voice of civil society and youth organizations is becoming more impactful. States can no longer simply ignore this voice. It is not surprising that civil society organizations, which you also represent, took an active stance on the issue of nuclear disarmament. The International Coalition of NGOs, established several years ago to advocate for elimination of nuclear weapons, led to the development of a new legally binding instrument on nuclear disarmament. In 2017, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was open for signature. This treaty, ratified to date by 51 member states, is a testimony to the broad disapproval of the current pace and scale of nuclear disarmament. It reflects the desire of millions of people to free the world of the existential threat nuclear weapons represent for humankind. With the entry into force of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, time has come for states possessing nuclear weapons to engage in dialogue to prevent their use and agree on near-term practical steps in nuclear disarmament under the obligations of Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which remains the cornerstone of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. Time has come to reinvigorate the global nuclear disarmament architecture so that it is fit for purpose to address the evolving nuclear weapon challenges of our time. The need to narrow divergences and rebuild mutual trust has never been greater. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very effective discussion.
Ambassador Volovaya, thank you very much for speaking to us today. We know that you have to leave very soon because you have another meeting. So just before you go, I want to thank you on behalf of all the participants here, and also for receiving the 3 appeals which we sent to your office yesterday, which was the International Day, which was the anniversary of the very first resolution. And later on, we'll have some of the endorsers of those appeals. We'll be speaking about some of those key aspects which they are promoting, which is very much focused on the cooperation between civil society, governments, and the United Nations to advance this objective of a nuclear weapons-free world. So again, thank you very much, everyone. And we know that we'll continue to have cooperation with you and your office in Geneva, and also with the broader framework of the United Nations in taking forward these initiatives. Thank you very much. I'm now going to pass the floor to Maria Fernanda Espinosa, who is a member of the World Future Council, which is one of the co-sponsors of this event, and is also one of the organizations that's been cooperating on one of the appeals which we presented later on by Vanda Proskova. Maria Fernanda Espinosa is also a former diplomat from her country, Ecuador, having served a number of ministerial roles, including foreign minister and defense minister. She also served as the UN ambassador of Ecuador to the United Nations in Geneva, and then she served as the president of the 73rd UN General Assembly. So she has a lot of experience at both government level, also at the United Nations level, and through the World Future Council, the civil society level. So she brings those 3 very important constituencies together in thinking about ways forward for nuclear disarmament. So Maria Fernanda Espinosa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, dear friend Alan Ware, for bringing us together once again to, push forward the agenda on disarmament. I thank the organizers of this event, and of course, I would like to acknowledge and thank Madam Tatiana Volovaya, director of the UN office in Geneva. I think that first of all, I would like to extend my greetings to all my fellow panelists. I'm deeply honored to join you in this commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations General Assembly Resolution number 1, which, as you very well mentioned at the beginning, established the goal of eliminating nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. I believe that the debate we are having here and the global appeals that are being presented today are really crucial for building the political momentum in the movement towards a world free of nuclear weapons, especially in the current context and the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that coincides, of course, with the the opening of the 2021 session of the UN Conference on Disarmament, the NPT review conference this year, and the inauguration of the new president of the United States, which is, as we all know, the country with the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. And all of this, I think, opens the opportunity for a boost in nuclear disarmament efforts. The General Assembly Resolution number 1 is the very first resolution to be adopted by consensus on 24 January 1946. And that was an early big step, I would call it, towards a world free of nuclear weapons. It was a logic response, of course, to the horrifying atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War. So in sometimes we think that it is not necessary to repeat what we already know, but sometimes it is good to recall why is that we are, calling so strongly for nuclear disarmament. And we know that no other technology, no other weapon of mass destruction has the capacity to quite literally change the face of the earth as a nuclear weapon. So most of us will never understand nor begin to realize the horror of an atomic bombing attack. You know, the nuclear bombing of Japan is to this day one of the worst tragedies in human history, having caused an estimated of 300,000 deaths. And 75 years later, here we are, the world still faces the existential threat of a nuclear war. Today, as we all know, approximately 15,000 nuclear weapons that are more powerful than those thrown in Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain in the stockpiles of 9 countries, and hundreds of them remain on high alert, ready to be launched within minutes. The situation is today even more dire, given that humanity is also facing a new immediate existential threat brought about by a human-caused climate change. And to that, we add the need to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic catastrophe. So yet again, let's repeat ourselves and the audience that is following this conversation that the development of nuclear weapons has been made on the premises of strategic deterrence. That is, on the idea that the possession of nuclear warheads has the power to discourage other states from taking military action against the nuclear state. However, these premises have proved to be completely false. You know, since the beginning of their atomic programs, nuclear states have constantly engaged in nuclear arms races, thus increasing the risk of bringing about a nuclear confrontation, which, taking into account number of nuclear warheads and the destructive power of such weapons, would wipe out humanity off the face of the earth. So it doesn't make much sense, and yet we continue to do the same. And having been a minister of defense of my country, believe me that from a military point of view, nuclear weapons represent 2 important contradictions. They are neither an effective deterrence mechanism nor a weapon that can be deployed for defensive purposes, as their use is a direct violation of the UN Charter requirement that member states resolve their conflicts in peaceful ways without recourse to the threat or use of force. That's the UN Charter, and 193 states are abide by the Charter. So from an international security perspective, they are also ineffective as a means of reaching strategic stability and are useless in addressing the most pressing security problems of humanity. You know, their development, production, stockpiling, the maintenance consume enormous financial and human resources that could be better used to address, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, protect the environment, and achieve the sustainable development goals. In sum, my message is that the possession of nuclear weapons is in fact one of the biggest threats to human security. And in this sense, it is actually the abolition of nuclear weapons and disarmament measures that build international, national, and regional peace, stability, and security. So with this in mind, I think it is evident that moving forward, disarmament and arms control is vital for our goals of reaching the 2030 agenda and delivering peace and security for all. So a key element of this agenda is, of course, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which just entered into force a few days ago, making it illegal for states parties to develop, test, produce, manufacture, acquire, process, use, etc., nuclear weapons. Although this treaty is supported by a large number of non-nuclear countries, it is still opposed by all nuclear states and their allies. However, I think it is important to highlight that all countries, including nuclear countries, are bound by existing international law and therefore cannot escape the prohibition of the threat or use of nuclear weapons and the obligation to eliminate these weapons. And this goes back to the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in '96, the Human Rights Committee in '84, and also more recently in 2018, affirming that international human rights law establish similar prohibitions and obligations, and therefore are also binding on the nuclear armed states. So I think that with this consideration, there is renewed hope. I think that President Biden, Vice President Harris would reconsider the US political stance towards the new treaty. So there is no doubt that if the US undertakes initial disarmament steps, they could bring other nuclear armed states to negotiate what we all want, a phased, verified, and enforceable nuclear disarmament process. I think that I don't want to repeat information we already know, but we know that 2,000 nuclear tests have been conducted since the end of the Second World War, with devastating consequences, not only for people and the planet, with critical effects on lives and livelihoods, our health, the environment. And I think that this has had a profound impact still today on all aspects of sustainable development. And of course, I couldn't, just not mention this, but I think that disarmament has also clear gender dimensions. Men and women are differently affected by the proliferation and use of weapons in general. I think that Parliament, civil society have a critical role to play, as the strong need and a call for the full and effective participation of women in all decision-making processes related to disarmament. This is essential for the promotion and attainment of sustainable peace and security. So I think that, as we all know, the Secretary General has prioritized gender parity as a moral duty and an operational necessity when talking about sustaining peace. So the meaningful inclusion of women, young women especially, in decision-making increases effectiveness and productivity. And this brings also new perspectives, new solutions to the table, and unlocks greater resources and strengthen efforts. And here again, I would like to pay tribute to Security Council Resolution 1325 that, as we all know, reinforces the critical role of women in preventing conflict and brokering and sustaining peace. And I think it is not a coincidence. It's very important to remember that countries ranked as the most stable and peaceful have a high number of women in leadership positions. Let me take the example of Iceland. Since 2008, Iceland remains the most peaceful country and a champion at the same time on gender equality. So I think women are proven strategic agents to sustaining peace, and it is of critical importance to keep that in mind. But as a contradiction, I would say, just let's pick an example of women political participation. Today, 75% of parliaments play a critical role here on the disarmament agenda. 75% of parliamentarians around the world are still men. So I think that there is a lot to do to ensure, that women and young women are, front and center of the peace and security agenda. So I would like now to just conclude my remarks by highlighting three elements, three takeaways that I believe are fundamental for the work on disarmament and that have been included in the appeals that we are releasing and endorsing today and in the past months. Number one, I think that the world must commit to the elimination of nuclear weapons by 2045, making the 100th anniversary of the United Nations the moment, for a world free of nuclear weapons. For that, I think that we need to take seriously the implementation of the UN disarmament agenda to unlock the sometimes hopeless conference on disarmament, enforce the NPT and take seriously the review conference this year, and to make the historic nuclear weapons ban treaty a reality on the ground. The number two message is that nuclear countries have to cut nuclear weapons budgets and investments in the nuclear weapons industry and redirect these investments and budgets to support the United Nations COVID-19 management and recovery, to fight global poverty and inequality, to reduce carbon emissions, and to finance the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a huge setback on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we will be much better off without wasting millions, billions in the arms race in general and nuclear weapons in particular. And number three, of course, women have to be at the front and center of any initiative, any idea, any recovery strategy. Investing in women and their well-being, in our economic and political empowerment, including our voice and agency in disarmament affairs, really pays off. Women are agents of change and peace, and there's proof, arithmetics of that. So we must always remember that peace, disarmament is a political choice. We need to strengthen multilateralism, and rather than an option, multilateral action is the only way to ensure a more peaceful future. Just as 75 years ago, we are facing profound multifold crisis due to the COVID pandemic. So we must advance towards a fairer, a more peaceful international order based on international law, of course. So I am convinced that an unequivocal sign to boost the legitimacy and the utility of multilateralism and the United Nations, as we saw in the poll of the beginning of this conversation. I think this will be, if we want to send a sign of effectiveness, it will be the prohibition and destruction of nuclear weapons. I am convinced it will not take us 75 more years. So we have the opportunity to change the path of history. And I thank you, and back to you, Alan.
Well, thank you very much, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, for a wonderful overview of both an aspirational approach to nuclear disarmament and ways of building that cooperation between civil society, legislators, United Nations officials, and government leaders, which you brought all into your presentation there. And our speakers coming after you will follow up on some of those. Our next speaker, I think, brings in also that cooperation between civil society, legislators, and the United Nations. And then we have two very dynamic young women activists who are making a real impact in the fields, building the connections between peace, disarmament, sustainable development, and building back better from the pandemic, which you also mentioned in your presentation. So I think we'll follow on from some of the comments you made. So thank you very much. I'll now pass on to Dr. Randy Rydell, who I hinted brings some of these constituencies together again, because he started his career in the United States Senate as a political advisor to Senator John Glenn on non-proliferation, disarmament, and security issues. Then he's moved to being a staff person in the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs, getting a lot of experience and rising to become a senior political advisor in the United Nations Office. And now he's on the board of the Arms Control Association and is a senior political advisor to the wonderful network of mayors, which is Mayors for Peace. So Dr. Rydell, you have the floor.
Thank you. Is the audio working fine now on this? Okay, Alan, I want to begin just with informally thanking you for your efforts in both with respect to the UN, but also in working with the parliamentarians. You've really done some path-breaking work in these fields, and I just want to give you credit for that, as well as for organizing our event today. Well, as we know, on 24th of January, 75 years ago, the UN General Assembly adopted its first resolution. Incidentally, they did that in London at Central Hall, Westminster. Interesting footnote to that. Which created a commission to, among other goals, establish a prohibition on nuclear weapons and other weapons adaptable to mass destruction. Adaptable to mass destruction. Now, that was just after the Second World War, which killed millions and introduced atomic weaponry that could destroy entire cities in an instant. Today, we are still grappling with the legacies of that tragedy. The persistence of nuclear weaponry, wars, inflated military budgets, failures in the peaceful resolution of disputes, and new threats of the use of force. The words of Charles Dickens capture the spirit of both of these eras. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. The resolution we commemorate today was a milestone in humanity's long pursuit of security through disarmament. Taboos against the use of indiscriminate weapons have actually existed for millennia, from the 2,000-year-old Sanskrit epic Ramayana through the 19th century European treaties to limit war and outlaw certain weapons to the Covenant of the League of Nations. Yet, interwar disarmament efforts were unsuccessful, and humanity had to endure another world war even more devastating than the previous one. Such were the circumstances in January 1946, when the General Assembly met to adopt its first resolution, which addressed the specific dangers from weapons of mass destruction. By December of that year, the General Assembly also adopted Resolution 41 with its wider range of principles governing both disarmament and conventional arms control. Thus, by the end of the UN's first year, it had established the foundation for its work in these fields for decades to come. As early as 1955, Dag Hammarskjöld was referring to disarmament as a hardy perennial, in his words, at the UN. That was 1955. By 1959, these mandates were combined into general and complete disarmament, which the General Assembly later designated as the UN's ultimate goal. And there have indeed been some significant achievements. We have witnessed over the years the creation of 5 regional nuclear weapon-free zones, widespread and growing recognition of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of using nuclear weapons, a moratorium on nuclear tests pending a global legal ban, deep cuts in deployments of strategic US and Russian nuclear arsenals, the closure of nuclear test sites and facilities for the production of fissile nuclear material for weapons, repeated reaffirmations in NPT arenas of disarmament commitments that have been reinforced by the International Court of Justice, the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the persistence of disarmament as a high priority of the General Assembly and the Secretary General, and signs that increasing numbers of young people are on board for disarmament. The existence of 186 non-nuclear weapon NPT states also testifies to the global support for nuclear disarmament today. Yet, of course, great challenges lie ahead, including the persistence of over 13,000 nuclear weapons, the lack of disarmament plans and negotiations, robust weapon modernization activities, the abandonment of some nuclear treaties, the lack of a fissile material treaty, the importance of bringing nuclear treaties to universal membership, chronic concerns over disarmament compliance, the need to address new controls over missiles, space weapons, missile defense, and advanced conventional weaponry, and the challenge of ending the long-standing and frustrating stalemate in the UN disarmament machinery. Yet beyond these difficult challenges lie 2 broader concerns regarding the legacy of the 1946 resolutions. Concerns that the international community can and must overcome. First, the world never fulfilled these early mandates to develop operational plans for both WMD disarmament and conventional arms control. Operational plans. If the vision found in these resolutions had been put into practice by states through the development of comprehensive plans and actions to implement them, many of the common criticisms of disarmament would vanish. The security system outlined in the Charter and early resolutions would not only have advanced disarmament, but would have also helped to solve the problem of war itself. The second disappointment concerns the huge gap between the noble goals of these resolutions and the policies, practices, and priorities of the member states. There is little congruence between the formal disarmament commitments of states and their actions, as seen in domestic legislation, regulations, budgets, policy statements, legislative structures, and the integration of disarmament into national defense and strategic priorities. Yet, the legacy of Resolutions 1 and 41 lives on today and continues to inspire new initiatives for moving forward. The Secretary General's recent disarmament agenda has offered a detailed blueprint for a more comprehensive approach to disarmament, one that is closer to the approach favored in 1946, and that is also deeply rooted in the language of the UN Charter. The more that national plans incorporate global disarmament norms, the closer nations will come to achieving, and not just aspiring to achieve, but achieving a more peaceful, prosperous, and secure world. On January 20th, military officers carried 2 nuclear footballs, they call them nuclear footballs, containing the means available to a departing and an arriving US president for launching nuclear weapons. Today, let us imagine a time when officers will accompany presidents around the world with a disarmament football containing all the tools needed for eliminating nuclear weapons globally. What would be in this disarmament football? These would include drafts of treaties, initiatives to improve compliance, strategies to achieve universal disarmament memberships, inspirational speeches for national and global audiences, rebuttals to anti-disarmament claims, proposals to strengthen verification, plans to expand engagement with civil society, ambitious programs for disarmament education, programs to allocate funds for research and development in disarmament, ways to guarantee the irreversibility of disarmament, improvements in transparency of nuclear arsenals and delivery systems, draft defense policies for security in a nuclear weapon-free world, and of course, the UN Charter must be in that football. This disarmament football contains all the tools we need to make our times the best of times. Thank you.
Dr. Rydell, thank you very much. This idea of a nuclear disarmed football is inspirational, and one I think that some of our young colleagues might turn into some wonderful infographics or memes for promoting in the social media. I think this has got the possibility of taking off. It flips it, the idea around from something negative, the football that could blow up the world, to the idea of something positive. And I think that's part of what consciousness change is about. And I'm really glad that you included the UN Charter there, because the UN Charter does have both the disarmament commitment and the commitment not to use or threat to use force, plus also it lists the different mechanisms that can be used to resolve conflicts and provide security without the threat or use of force. So it's a really good handy book to carry around. So I'm glad you would include that in the disarmament football. So I mentioned, we have a couple of young speakers here who are generating new ideas along with other youth in the world to take forward not just nuclear disarmament, but also the other very related goals of peace, the Sustainable Development Goals, climate protection, and building back better from the pandemic. And one of the most inspiring of those is our next speaker, Kekashan Basu, who is a member of the World Future Council. She set up her first environmental group when she was 8 years old. She was an advisor to the United Nations on sustainable development when I think she was 11 years old. She's been recognized by Time magazine and National Geographic as, leading young environmentalist. And she was also given the first Gorbachev, not Perry, Schultz, sorry, yes, the Gorbachev-Schultz First Voices for a Nuclear Weapons-Free World Youth Award just last year. So Kekashan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alan. It's really great to be here today in such august company and during this commemoration. So as a 20-year-old, 75 years seems to me to be a very, very long time, but that's how long it has been since the leaders of that UN General Assembly gathered on that day in 1946, as my fellow panelists have already said, to adopt resolution number 1 that called for the establishment of a commission to deal with the problems raised by the discovery of atomic energy, whose 75th anniversary we are commemorating today. And 7.5 decades later, that is more than the average lifetime. Yet the threat of nuclear weapons, much like this proverbial sword of Damocles, continues to hang by a thin thread over humanity. And a threat so fragile that can snap at the press of a button and literally push humanity and also all other life forms on our planet irrevocably towards extinction. And the glaring irony of it all befuddles me, more so because our policymakers and leaders who call for our votes ostensibly to make our life better for us can't seem to agree upon obliterating this human-created threat that's far more potent and lethal than any virus known to us. And even when some nations do agree, as in the case of the ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, we also have the Nuclear Club of Nations using all their muscle and influence to coerce signatory nations to withdraw from it, as the USA did by sending letters to these nations. And the Associated Press published excerpts of this USA letter sent in October last year that states, although we recognize your sovereign right to ratify or accede to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, we believe that you have made a strategic error and should withdraw your instrument of ratification or accession. Now, this is a David versus Goliath situation in real life. And for truth and good to prevail, we have to make David larger and stronger than Goliath. And that can only happen if we're able to de-link national security and patriotism from nuclear weapons and lay bare the real agenda of profit and megalomania that drives this insane race. This farce was on full display when on 7th September last year, India celebrated the successful test firing of its hypersonic technology demonstrator vehicle, making it only the 4th country in the world after the USA, China, and Russia to develop and test a technology that would pave the way for missiles that would travel at 6 times the speed of sound. And on that same day, India recorded over 90,000 new COVID-19 cases, moving to 2nd place in the list of countries that with the most infections, with 4.2 million cases. And on that same day as well, thousands would have died there of hunger. Over 100 women would have been abused and violated, and thousands of migrants would have gone to bed hungry. And for a country that holds the dubious record of over 56 million children out of school, the highest in the world, and is amongst the top 10 countries in the Global Hunger Index, what can be more ironic than celebrating as a matter of national pride the launch of another vehicle of mass annihilation? And the same story plays out in different forms in China, in the USA, in Russia, in North Korea, and the other nuclear armed states. And our focus should not just be on the end product, on nuclear weapons, but on the elimination of the entire process from mining, production, and waste siting. Because at each step of this process, there is injustice. And I call it nuclear colonialism because it is a system of domination through which governments and corporations disproportionately target and devastate indigenous peoples and their lands to maintain the nuclear production process. And it operates under the guise of clean energy because nuclear energy emits fewer greenhouse gases than fossil fuel power plants. But the entire cycle of nuclear missile production, as well as power generation from the raw material sourcing to waste siting, makes it the greatest perpetrator of environmental injustices of the modern era. And its danger lies in the fact that its impacts, despite affecting millions around the world, remains invisible in the public domain. Now, as a young person, I am convinced that our generation must take on the responsibility of obliterating this menace before it obliterates us. But how can we make David stronger and larger than Goliath? The route to that lies through education. Disarmament education holds the key to removing the mists of secrecy and misinformation that allow these nations to justify their nuclear agenda to the masses. And that is our mission at my organization, Green Hope Foundation, where we use education for sustainable development as a transformative tool to empower all sections of society, especially those communities whom the world seems to have forgotten. Yet these are the people who suffer the most from these foibles of national policy that allows a country to profligately spend billions of dollars on building a nuclear warhead while their hospitals do not even have enough ventilators. Our work on peace and sustainability is not about strikes and protests, but through grassroots actions that alleviate the sufferings of those who are the farthest first. In Bangladesh, we are empowering COVID-ravaged villages by building toilets, providing skills-based education on sustainable farming, turning women into poultry farming entrepreneurs, building deep bore tube wells that provide them with clean water, as well as building rainwater harvesting systems. We are establishing local circular economies, making them healthier through improved sanitation and hygiene. In Liberia, we are installing solar panels for electrification of villages that allow young people safe spaces to study, moving them away from a life of drugs and crime. And all through this process, our academy spread awareness about the need for disarmament, about climate justice, about biodiversity conservation, and how all these global issues are interlinked. Our work dispels the myth that children are too young to understand the threat of nuclear weapons. Our grassroots experience in educating children, be it in a school in Toronto or in the Rohingya refugee camps of Kutupalong on the border of Myanmar and Bangladesh, have vindicated time and again our belief that age has got no relation to capability and understanding. Through this process of education, we are empowering young people with the knowledge and skills that will ultimately enable them to reach positions of influence and decision-making so that we will have more young people in parliament and possibly on the boards of these powerful armaments corporations, and only then will the tide turn. And while this transformation takes shape, we must not give up hope, but continue to collaborate, throwing our full support behind just policies and declarations such as that of the World Future Council's call to abolish nuclear weapons to assure a sustainable future. Most importantly, I feel that this is an opportune moment to push the nuclear club to acknowledge the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, as well as put into effect General Assembly's #1 Resolution Clause 5CE that calls for the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons and of all other major weapons adaptable to mass destruction. Let us remind ourselves bluntly, either we end it or it will end us. Thank you.
Kakashan, thank you so much for both a passionate speech, but also for connecting so many of the key issues, sustainable development goals, the poverty on the one hand, while the nuclear weapon states are sinking resources into new weapons designed to kill, and the really importance of education that you've pioneered by doing so much grassroots education with young people in Asian countries and Middle East countries and in Canada, or actually all around the world, with your foundation and also with the other initiatives which you're part of. So thank you very much for the inspiring words and for your work on the ground, as well as your work in the higher levels of engaging with officials and leaders through the United Nations. We're now passing on to another young leader, Wanda Proskova, who is the Vice Chair of the Prague Vision Institute for Sustainable Security, and is also one of the co-leaders, co-conveners of Youth Fusion, which is the global network of youth that's engaged in the campaign for the elimination of nuclear weapons associated with Abolition 2000. And Wanda is also representative of parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. She's developing the Gender, Peace and Security program, which has been led by a number of legislators in that. Just before I give the floor to Wanda, I'll just remind people that there will be question and answer after this. Please put your questions into the question and answer box. I already see, quite a few, and we'll be asking those questions of the panelists just after Wanda gives her presentation. And Wanda, we will be presenting the appeals, which we mentioned earlier on in the piece. So Wanda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alan, for the introduction, and to all the attendees. It is an honor to participate in a webinar with all of you. And a special thank you, of course, that needs to go to my fellow panelists here for making the time to be here with us. For me as a young woman in the field, it's been just wonderful and so inspiring to listen to all the speeches today. So thank you again. And so from all the previous presentations, it's somewhat clear to me that a certain cooperation between the whole United Nations and the civil society is absolutely essential to achieve our common goal of sustainable security, and in this specific case, nuclear disarmament. And this is why I would like to present to you the total of 3 civil society appeals relating to the 75th anniversary of the very first resolution of the United Nations, their calls for nuclear abolition, and why it is key for us to pay attention to them. So let me just quickly share my screen here. Perfect. All right, so the first one is a statement by the Coordinating Committee of Abolition 2000. And for those who don't know, Abolition 2000 is a civil society network of over 1,000 organizations promoting a nuclear weapon-free world. And just to create a link to today's events, Youth Fusion, one of the co-sponsors of this webinar, is proud to be one of Abolition 2000's working groups. So the statement is entitled "Time to Wrap Up the Nuclear Weapon Era," and was published on the occasions of the entry into force of the TPNW, which was also mentioned here today a couple of times, and the 75th anniversary of the first UN resolution. It highlights the fact that while nuclear armed states may refuse to join the TPNW, they simply cannot escape the previously existing law, specifically their obligations to achieve nuclear disarmament, which they agreed to by consensus precisely when adopting the first resolution 75 years ago. While everyone can read the full statement online, and I'll post the links in the chat later to all of the 3 appeals, I'd just like to highlight the statement's call on all ratifying states of the TPNW to pass comprehensive implementation legislations that would include prohibitions on the transit and financing on nuclear weapons, and thus creating a direct impact and restrictions on the current deployment of nuclear weapons. All right. Moving on to the second statement, which also very much deserves the attention, is the joint statement by World Future Council members and Right Livelihood laureates. And I'm so happy just to mention that we here have, of course, Maria Fernanda Espinosa and Kakashian Basu and Alan Ware, who are all endorsers of this joint statement. So again, everyone can read the statement full online. However, worth pointing out is the argument used in the statement against nuclear deterrence, that all states' legal obligation under Article 2 of the UN Charter to achieve security without reliance on the threat or use of force in their international relations. So, and the statement further marks down the 5 measures the nuclear armed and allied states should now take, from affirming that nuclear war cannot be won and thus never be fought, and also to cutting down on nuclear weapons budgets and redirecting the investments into budgets supporting the UN, sustainable development, and of course, COVID-19 recovery, which keeps being highly relevant even in 2021. So finally, moving on to the final appeal, which is entitled Protect People and the Planet, the Appeal for a Nuclear Weapon-Free World, which is an appeal launched by the We the People's 2020, which is a coalition of 100 civil society organizations. So far, the appeal has been endorsed by over 700 representatives of civil society, including parliamentarians, youth, religious leaders, academics, former UN officials, and so many more individuals. And it is calling out the large investments in nuclear weapons that are simply needed elsewhere, and then calling on our cities, parliaments, and governments to commit to the elimination of nuclear weapons at least by 2045, which is, as we all know, the 100th anniversary of the United Nations, and to adopt no first use policies, and again, cut nuclear weapons budgets. And so what's different about this appeal is that unlike the others, this is an open endorsement. So on behalf of We the People's 2020, I'd like to invite all of you who haven't done so yet to endorse and perhaps attach a short quote along with your endorsement so that you could join this nice board of quotes. And that's also because the statement will further be presented at the NPT review conference later this year and some additional events. So I know we don't have that much time, but to summarize, all of these 3 statements or appeals, there are many laws and tools that governments can use to participate in nuclear disarmament, regardless of whether a country joins the TPNW or not. Further, even with now having the TPNW in place, in force, there is still a lot to be done. So I'd like to encourage you all to read through the statements and perhaps share them with your networks. I think that pure information sharing is also an efficient tool to help the cause. And finally, remember that the We the People's 2020 appeal is still open for endorsement. So if you haven't done so, you're of course welcome to join in. And finally, specifically a message to all the young enthusiasts in the audience. Thank you for being here with us and for educating yourselves with us. And if you are one of those people who would like to get involved but aren't yet sure how exactly, make sure to check out Youth Fusion and its programs. There's really something for everyone, from free webinars to articles and different programs. So in short, that'll be it from me. I'll post all the links in the chat, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Vanda. And if you have a chance, could you put some of the web links into the chat for people? The Youth Fusion web link, which you mentioned, and also the web link for the appeal, which you mentioned, which, as you said, will be also presented to the NPT review conference and also to the Assembly of Parliaments when they're coming together, the World Assembly of Parliaments. So there's more opportunities to take these voices forward. Thank you very much. So we're now moving, we have about half an hour for question and answer time. We already have quite a number of questions, but please, if you still have more, put them into the question and answer box. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of group some of the questions together because some of them are similar, and I'll do a couple of rounds of questions to the panelists. So the first group of questions that I'll deal with are relating very much to working with the nuclear armed states and possibilities for that. So one of the questions, and I'll put all the questions, and I'll ask any of the panelists who want to address these to answer. One of the questions, this was from Eva Quistorp, who I think was the founder or one of the founders of the International Women's Day for Peace and Disarmament, May the 24th, a former parliamentarian from Germany. Her question is, how do we as civil society and as legislators have an impact in countries which have much less democratic possibilities of advancing these issues, such as China and Russia. How can we deal with those countries and get them on board on the nuclear disarmed issues? Then there was also a question from, can't sure who it was, but it was about the idea of what possibilities there are for the new US administration, the Biden administration, to make progress on nuclear risk reduction and disarmament measures with Russia. There's still very big conflicts between the US and Russia. And is it possible to take forward the START agreements, which are on lowering the numbers of nuclear weapons in agreement with Russia, and also nuclear risk reduction like no first use and de-alerting? What possibilities might there be for that? And a third question in the group of how to deal with the nuclear armed states was asked, can we expect that any one of these countries, even the United States, might unilaterally give up its nuclear weapons, or can we only rely on multilateral approaches? So I've put those questions out and ask panelists if you would like to address one or all of those in the general context of how best to engage with the nuclear armed states to make progress. Would Maria or Randy like to go first? See, you both have experience in this field. Okay, Dr. Rydell.
I'll take a crack at it. All of these questions are great. A lot of focus now is on Washington, given the advent of a new administration. It's quite interesting that among the key appointments that the Biden administration has made in the field of non-proliferation and arms control, and by implication disarmament, there is a very significant addition of women in top positions in the State Department, top positions in the National Security Council, all dealing with these WMD issues. The woman who's going to be the new Undersecretary of State for Arms Control is a leading voice for gender equality in the national security system of the US. And she's also an expert and has long experience in dealing with the problem of what used to be known as cooperative threat reduction, which was an effort by the United States and the new Russian Federation in the 1990s to reduce risks of accidents and miscalculations and use of nuclear weapons. So from both perspectives, having the voice of women in top positions in government, and secondly, not to mention our vice president, incidentally, and also to have expertise in the field of risk reduction, I think is a very a positive sign, and something that I hope that can be built upon. I'm not denying that there are huge obstacles that remain to be overcome, but I think I'll stop on that. But those are the points that I wanted to make in that respect.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rydell. Kekashan, did you have some comments on engaging with the nuclear armed states and what progress can be made?
Yes, I'd just like to add to what Dr. Rydell said, that yes, we definitely need more women in positions of power, but also young people, because as was mentioned earlier in the panel, the younger generation is definitely more for peace and disarmament than some of our older generations were. So getting more young people into parliament and recognizing their expertise and the unique viewpoint that they bring would definitely help to ensure that the nuclear club tries to move away from nuclear weapons and ultimately achieves disarmament. So, yeah.
Thanks, Kekashan. And Maria, did you have something to comment here, having with your experience both as a foreign minister and also as president of the UN General Assembly and having to deal with representatives of nuclear armed states, your thoughts on possibilities for taking this forward with the nuclear armed states?
Well, first of all, I think it's well known that I am a stubborn optimist. And I know it's difficult, but I think that we have to learn from history. You know, nuclear weapons have proven to be so ineffective, to ensure, peace and stability. They have not been effective as a deterrence mechanism. They're really not effective as a security protection for countries, but on the contrary. And I think that we are living, a moment in history where I see, interest and appetite for transformation. And I'm a strong believer in multilateral solutions. I'm a strong believer in the role of the United Nations. I know it is difficult. I know that we have witnessed, especially in the past 3 or 4 years, an increasing polarization, tensions in the current geopolitics. But at the same time, I think that we are all talking about building back better, about recovering, about investing more, in our commons, including the atmosphere. And I think that the entry point, politically and conceptually, should be, the concept of human security. Yeah. And I think that human security should be considered a global commons and a collective responsibility. I have great hopes for the new administrations in the UN. I have also, I think, hopes in redirecting the budgets, and that it very much, is under the responsibility of parliaments and parliamentarians. In just, for us to get a sense of what is on stake here. The nuclear budget, you're experts, Vanda and Alan, on that, but it's approximately $73 billion in like the global nuclear budget or something like that. Am I correct? I don't want to say any wrong figures.
Yeah, between 75 and 100 billion. It depends on what's brought into the equation.
What do you add? Okay. But we're not talking here small money. Mm-hmm. And do we have an idea of what is the UN budget every year? Not to speak about developing countries, national budget. I mean, the UN budget, who is supposed to be the multilateral organization solving and addressing every single conflict from around the world, including COVID, and the access to and deployment of vaccines, etc. So the budget of the UN is approximately $3 billion. So let's just compare, and it doesn't make sense. I think it really is a strong call for common sense, and common sense coming from our political leaders, from the big powers around the world. And I think that we can see, let's hope that we will see this year things happen. Let's closely follow the NPT review conference. Let's closely follow the implementation of the historical prohibition treaty that just came into force on the 22nd of January, etc. So we have the international law instruments in hand, and we have to make it happen. But it not only that I'm a strong believer in the role of the UN and multilateralism, but a strong role in the force and wisdom and voice of young people. And I'm so happy to share this panel with Vanda and with Kakashian. I mean, they are really speaking up. We used to say, on behalf of young people, so we would represent their voices, but now they have their own voices, their own spaces, their own platforms. And I am very, very excited and optimistic that they're so vocal and so smart in the disarmament agenda in general.
Thank you very much. Just quickly on the budgets, and then I'll go to Evander. So the global Move the Nuclear Weapons Money campaign, which I'll put the website into the chat session soon, has looked at the global nuclear weapons budget and what that money could instead be spent on, which includes the annual budget of the United Nations, which should be expanded because it needs to have more money to deal effectively with all the tasks that it's taken on, plus meeting all the different sustainable development goals and taking those forward, plus climate protection, ensuring that there is investments in renewable energies to ensure the phase out of fossil fuels, and also, the economic and conversion of those who rely on fossil fuels. We all have mapped that out in the Move the Nuclear Weapons Money campaign, but also what people can do in terms of moving that money from the nuclear weapons, whether they're in nuclear armed states, to be able to lobby directly. For example, in the United States, Senator Markey has put forward the SANE Act, Smarter Approach to Nuclear Expenditure, which has cuts of huge amounts from the nuclear weapons budget to put into these key issues. Or if you're not in a nuclear armed state, to move your governments or your pension funds or your cities or your own investments away from investing in the nuclear weapons industry. And already 4 governments have done that at the federal level. My own government, New Zealand, plus Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Norway have all divested the sovereign wealth funds, public investment funds, their pension, public employee pension funds, etc., from the nuclear arms race. And if more and more countries do that, particularly those that ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, this could be one of the things they could do to implement that. Then that could help shift the financial incentives, which at the moment are for weapons, away from weapons, and put the financial incentives to better things. So there is some work being done on that through the Move the Nuclear Weapons Money campaign. And I'll now pass on to Vanda, who had some comments.
Thanks. No, I just wanted to quickly follow up on Kekashan's comment, because yes, it is absolutely essential to engage young people, but we also have to educate them about these issues in the first place. And when we were doing, different roundtables or conferences or just different talks, whether with Youth Fusion or Prague Vision, we in 99.9% of the time come to the conclusion that students studying, international relations or global governance or whatever field that you would expect that nuclear weapons would be mentioned in their courses, they always tell us that they have almost no idea, and then no one in their universities tells them about these issues or discusses this with them. And I see that as a very, very big issue. So whether we're tackling this through these free webinars or movie screenings or roundtables or social media campaigns or whatever we can now do safely, we need to get these information out there, and education and awareness sharing is so essential. So this is something that we also need to be thinking about. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now, there was another group of questions which were around something which Maria Fernanda Espinosa talked about, and that's about building more engagement in common security and the use of international law to provide security and resolve conflicts, rather than the reliance on the threat or use of force or on nuclear weapons. So one of these questions comes from Gray Southern from the United Nations Association of New Zealand. I think it's like 5 o'clock in the morning his time. And he raises this, saying, if we're going to convince nuclear armed states to give up on nuclear weapons, can we convince them that they can resolve their conflicts through common security mechanisms, including through the UN? And how do we do that? And then Joan Rousseau asked a similar question, but more on the nuclear law side. If nuclear weapons are illegal, then can we better use the law mechanisms like the International Court of Justice, UN human rights bodies, and the International Criminal Court to advance the illegality of nuclear weapons and the responsibility of states to implement both the policies against use of nuclear weapons and their disarmament obligations through those legal bodies? So the common security questions and the legal bodies. So is there a panelist or panelists who would like to address those 2 questions? Okay, Dr. Rydell.
I'm hesitant to jump in here because I'm not a lawyer, but I have enormous respect for law and its usefulness in this field. I mentioned in my talk a obscure concept called general and complete disarmament, which is it's a goal found in 12 multilateral treaties, including Article 6 of the NPT. General and complete disarmament is a mixture of a combination of security tools that are found based largely on the Charter. They first and foremost include disarmament of weapons of mass destruction. Secondly, the limitation and regulation of conventional arms. But then there are other features to it that don't get much attention, which is the development of better mechanisms for the peaceful resolution of disputes, improved ways of reducing threats or use of force, and lastly, cutting back military spending and redirecting those resources into human security and meeting infrastructure needs and basically meeting basic human needs. What I'm trying to say is that peaceful settlement of disputes and threats that are at the root of the UN Charter are very, very much tied with our future ability to achieve disarmament goals. Two of the greatest long-term trends that are going on in this field with respect to disarmament our first one is bringing the rule of law to disarmament by emphasizing treaties, universal membership in treaties, full compliance with treaties, and the development of new treaties. It's bringing the rule of law to disarmament. But the second is bringing democracy to disarmament, which means more of a role for civil society, more of a role by small states, including the coalition of states that formed the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So I'm so glad this question got asked, because every time you hear criticisms of disarmament, they say, well, it'll just leave the world more insecure and unstable. They don't understand that disarmament is very complex and involves a lot of progress across the board, not just in dealing with one or two weapons. And but they all go on simultaneously, and that's the beauty of it all. It's not like first we must have peace and then we have disarmament. They both go hand in hand. Sorry for the long answer.
Thank you. Did any of the other panelists want to make a comment on that?
Well, perhaps, Alan, I would really like to echo what Randy said about international law and the importance of deploying what we have in hand to look at the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice of 1996, for example, to look at what we have in hand, the Human Rights Committee and the Human Rights Council in 1984 and 2018. You know, and I think that we cannot deny that we are living a trust deficit, you know, in our international organizations, and young people know that very well. So I think that to match international law, existing multilateral agreements on disarmament and action is of critical importance to bring back, you know, legitimacy and trust regarding our international institutions. I was reading at the end of the year just these the Global Values survey by Edelman, and it is scary because you see that people have stopped trusting parliaments, political parties, political leaders, and that is scary because we do need to make sure that we revitalize our democratic institutions. And that includes international multilateral institutions, of course. So the challenge is huge, but we should not dismay. I keep repeating that the worst thing that can happen, is indifference. And we cannot be indifferent from, wherever we are. And I'm very encouraged to see that there's a lot of young people connected to this conversation. And Vanda saying that we need to do more awareness raising in young people. And I think this is the path, because if the majority of society has, the level of consciousness, of commitment, and speak up, I think that we will be, much better off.
Great, thank you very much. Now, the next set of questions is actually about this, about education. But to segue from one to the other, I just want to mention something about the common security and international law, because what I feel, and it's a little bit related to what Randy talked about before, shifting the thinking from the nuclear football to a disarmament football, is that when people look at international conflicts and at the international political systems, including the United Nations, too often they just look at the things that don't work well, the things that aren't working well. Very little attention is given, whether it's media attention or public attention, to all the incredible successes that have happened, including in resolving conflicts between countries using the mechanisms of the International Court of Justice, or the mediation services of the Secretary General, or the new special envoys that the Secretary General has appointed, which is helping to mediate some of the intrastate state conflicts. And I myself come from a country, New Zealand, that's used these mechanisms to resolve big conflicts. We had a conflict with France over nuclear testing in the Pacific. We got it resolved through the International Court of Justice. We no longer have nuclear testing in the Pacific. We had a terrorism situation that got resolved through the mediation services of the Secretary General. But you don't see these in the news. So I'm thinking that in order to help advance this common security, the use of international law, and to the confidence that this can help us resolve our differences without relying on the threat or use of force, we need education about it. And one really good movie is about the situation of Costa Rica, which abolished their army and then has been using the courts and diplomacy to resolve their borders disputes, etc. So this is a segue to education, how important it is. Education about the issue, but also about how it's possible to achieve peace through the use of law and mediation and the United Nations. But in particular, the questions, which I'll now address to Kakashan and Vanda, were how do we get more awareness amongst young youth, about this particular issue? There is a lot of movement by youth on climate issue, for example, but not so much on nuclear disarmament. Can we get this issue into universities? Can we get this issue into the curriculums in schools? Can we get this issue, amongst the social media messaging from young people? So this was particularly questions to Kakashan and Vanda. Kakashan, you go first.
Yeah, first of all, Alan, I'd like to say I agree with you that the media often, almost always portrays only the negative aspects of not just nuclear disarmament and nuclear weapons, but a lot of our world's challenges. And that creates the sense of hopelessness and leads people to ask that, oh, what can I do to, stop all of these world problems? I'm just one person. And that's why I'm not going to do anything about it because it seems so big. But actually portraying the positive aspects and what has already been achieved can definitely help to lift the spirits and allow people to move forward with their movement. In terms of education, that definitely plays a very big role. And I also saw another question that asked about, how we can get more school children involved in this. And I definitely think that by partnering with school boards and demonstrating how useful it is to talk about nuclear disarmament, that's a huge step. And that is what Green Hope is doing now in various countries. And once the boards see the results, they would be more likely to change policies. And in places where it's still taboo to talk about disarmament and nuclear weapons, I think it's better to start with implementing a curriculum on the Sustainable Development Goals and use that as a medium to speak about all of the goals, including Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and thereby disarmament. So I definitely think that that's very important. And at the same time, using non-formal methods of communication, which that, again, what Green Hope Foundation does through music, art, dance, drama, and sport, which is why I really liked the idea of disarmament football to actually enable children, especially the younger children, to understand these issues and also understand what they can do in their own small way to ensure peace, ensure disarmament, or at least at the very first step, know about what these problems are. Because if you don't know about it, how are you supposed to solve these issues? And we can't wait until children get to university to start educating them on all of these issues. It has to start from the elementary school level. And like I said in my remarks before, we can't just think of children as being too young to understand these issues. They do understand it. And of course, we have to make sure that, you know, the language that we use to explain these issues to them is tailored towards their sensibilities. But it should not, we should not say that we can't tell children about this, because that would be wrong. So yeah, I think, again, education is literally the key to achieving a sustainable future, and disarmament education plays a very big role in that education for sustainable development.
Thank you, Kekashan. Vanda, do you have some comments?
If I may, just a couple. No, absolutely agree with Kekashan's on the connections and building up on the 17 SDGs. You know, the motto of the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind. So at Youth Fusion, we were trying to highlight that you can't really focus on climate change and forget about nuclear weapons, or you can't really talk about gender equality and not mention the impact of nuclear weapons again, or vice versa. So to me, it's so important to be highlighting how interconnected it all is. And also with respect to young people, and the Move the Nuclear Weapons Money campaign is working really well there, because when we're talking about the money that we're spending and then comparing it to, you know, how much are our student loans, then that's something so personal to us and so relevant. It just makes it click. And other forums like Model United Nations are a great way to engage students, or different roundtables, or just generally other forms of conversations. But also, very quickly, the idea of an intergenerational dialogue is to me, and to Youth Fusion in general, so important, you know, to learn from the experienced voices. And I'm so glad that that's also what we're doing here today. And to learn how to use what we already have, how to build on it or update it where it's necessary, but to really have a communication and a dialogue, because that to me is key.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that point on intergenerational solidarity, because there's currently this mindset amongst a lot of young people that the older generations are the worst. They are literally the devil. We can't do anything with them. And only this younger generation is doing the right thing. And I don't think that's true, because I learned so much from my parents and grandparents, and there's so much wisdom to be gleaned from our older generations, and there's good and bad in every generation. So really understanding that education is a two-way street, you're never too old or too young to learn, I think that would definitely help to take us forward in this path towards a peaceful world.
Well, thank you very much, Kekashan. We're coming to near the end of the webinar. I'd like to give each of the panelists opportunity for maybe about 1 minute to give any final concluding comments. I apologize, there were a few other questions which we didn't have time to answer. I'll just flag them, and maybe one or two of the panelists will mention it briefly in their concluding comments. There were some further comments about the possibility of taking forward no first use, or whether it may be better to call sole purpose, and whether it's possible to reverse in the United States Congress the negative actions which President Trump had done by taking the US out of JCPOA, the Iran deal, and out of START. And also there were questions on what other roles can parliamentarians take. And there was a couple of questions also about the connections with other disarmament agreements like biological weapons and chemical weapons. And I think that also related to Randy's issue of the general and complete disarmament. You know, are there links? Can we learn from some of the regimes for one for the other? There are a couple of the questions, but I just leave it up to the panelists, whatever you'd like for closing comments for 1 minute. And I'll start